Well, I'm joined in the studio now by the Crown Prince of Iran, Reza Pahlavi, who says this is a moment for a reset in the Middle East. Great to see you again.
Good to see you again.
So much has happened. I mean, every time I see you, so much has happened. But what do you make of where we are in the Middle East right now?
In a nutshell, I don't think there's any moment after 46 years that we see the Iranian regime as its weakest. And in proportion to that, the Iranian people as resolved and determined than ever before. The loss of proxies and the fall of the Bashar regime in Syria has been a severe blow to the regime means of implementing its sort of beyond its border intervention and fomenting, conflict. And so therefore, they really have their backs to the wall right now.
The speed that Assad was driven out of Syria in the end was very dramatic. These things often can be like that. Is there any real expectation that there could be a similar uprising in Iran, for example, that the people look at what happened in Syria and think, yeah, we can do that? Mm-hmm. And would it be achievable?
You know, Piers, the first time that we met, I think you were still with CNN.
Yeah.
We had the first interview.
Yeah.
And throughout the years, I think you can also remember that while we had several generations of protests in Iran throughout the years and the decades, the frequency of them have become much more, particularly since the Mahsa revolution, and the fact that Iranians are more than ever ready to go beyond the regime. The cries on the streets, the protests of death to the dictator, death to the Islamic regime are louder than ever, including the last few days, which was around the anniversary, the 46th anniversary of the revolution. What's, however, important for all of us to realize is that I believe there's an alignment of the stars in terms of a golden opportunity to put an end to the very root of the crisis all over, which is the regime itself. The epicenter has always been Tehran. I said in the way that the regime is weak and the people are ready. The important thing is for some governments who are behind the curve to catch up to that. Why do I say this is important? Because as I'm sure everybody wants to avoid conflict or escalation of conflict. And the only way to avoid conflict, particularly if diplomacy has failed to achieve what was a false premise of behavior change, and there has to be a reset, as you said, of policy, the best way to address the issue so that we don't lead directly from failed diplomacy to conflict and aggression is to provide a third alternative, which is empowering the Iranian people this time. So therefore, a policy of maximum pressure that so far has been implemented in the regime has to be coupled with a policy of maximum support, thereby enabling the Iranian people to ultimately achieve that goal of liberation, put an end to this regime, and instead of what we had as a major source of instability, instead have an element that brings stability and peace, which is conducive to realistic prospect of permanent solutions, shall we say, about the Israeli-Palestinian issue that cannot be achieved as long as this regime is there sabotaging every effort.
Right, so I mean, the belief is that Iran's tentacles extend to Hezbollah, the Houthis, Hamas, and that they've all been destabilized to a degree. But possibly the ideology behind it has not been. Certainly in Gaza, for example, the US intelligence believe that perhaps you've killed a lot of Hamas terrorists, but that the thinking that belies them actually may have been fueled by everything that's gone on there. What do you think of that?
I would say that it's very hard to defeat an ideology by killing people. What needs to eradicate an ideology is to give the people an alternative whereby they can escape regimes that try to dominate via ideology, whether it's communism like we saw during the Cold War and the Soviet Union, or an Islamic theocracy that is trying to push its agenda of exporting an ideology, of course, at the expense of the population of the country from which they're using as a launching pad, which serve as for Khomeini and his entire vision of exporting this ideology across the world. The alternative is there because the ask of people today in Iran is the very same values that the free world enjoys and aspire by: human rights, democracy, no discrimination of any form. And that's exactly what the Iranian people want. Against the DNA of a regime that cannot coexist in the world based on that conflict of values, which is why you cannot ever achieve a reasonable outcome by compromising with them. That's why you cannot trust them. That's why they will never agree to it. Even as lately of President Trump trying to still offer yet another opportunity for them to come clean, Khamenei rejects it, not because it's irrational, but because he can afford to agree to it. And these are why
What do you think of President Trump's come up with this idea that the Palestinians should all be taken in by Egypt and Jordan, 2 million people? It's been met with huge kickback from the Palestinians and from other Arab countries in the region. But as with many things that Trump says, you know, maybe he's trying to create a debate here about what should actually happen, because most of Gaza has been flattened. I mean, what happens to these people, do you think?
Well, first of all, my heart goes out to the victims of all of these conflicts. But we have to think of what is the permanent and only solution. Again, I think that when you have a regime in Iran that is an element of instability, that is fomenting aggression, supports terrorism, how could you possibly, in that atmosphere, talk about legitimate, possible, lasting peace? I think the key element to change the entire situation in the Middle East and beyond is the impact that the regime has if the regime is no longer there. And instead you have a government that, first of all, is representative of the people of Iran's aspiration, people who want peace, who don't have any hostility or aggression towards Israel or the Arabs or any ethnicity or any religion. Instead, we want to be contributors to stabilizing our region. That's where finally we can see a two-state solution taking place.
The Ayatollah in that scenario?
Well, again, I think that the formula that we have always prescribed to, you're familiar with it, you remember me saying it all along, is that the Iranian people are the ultimate agent of change. They are your true boots on the ground.
So you would see a similar scenario to what we saw in Syria?
Well, I mean, I think Iran is really unique in terms of we cannot draw a parallel to, let's say, Iraq or Afghanistan or Syria as recently as it has been.
But in terms of the people themselves within the country rising up against the regime?
Well, that's what the people of Iran have been trying to do, except that they've been alone in this fight. They have received no support whatsoever from the outside world. And the reason I say this is because successful campaign of change of regimes in a non-violent way, without involving foreign intervention or military occupation or what have you, could not have been achieved all by itself without some tacit support from the free world. Example, solidarity movement in Poland at the end of the Cold War, or the support for Nelson Mandela and the ANC to put an end to apartheid in South Africa. In the same spirit, I think that empowerment means that we're giving the people a real chance to stand up to a regime. They need to be fortified. They need to be engaged with. And I think the shift that I'm talking about in policy and a reset is that instead of talking about appeasement, instead of talking about expecting a behavior change, and they have been given ample chance to come clean and they haven't, isn't it time for once to give the Iranian people a chance to really be the agent of change and trust the Iranian people in the fact that they aspire to the very same principle that the free world is governed by, against a regime that is completely neglecting these rights to begin with. It's a win-win for all. It's really a situation that will be a relief to our immediate neighbors. It will be an element that addresses the security concerns of many countries. It eliminates the existential threat to Israel. And most importantly, and I'm sure Donald Trump as a businessman will appreciate this, is good for business too. Right. You have to have a stable environment in order to have economic opportunities.
What is the one thing you would like President Trump to do right now to help facilitate this?
Well, one thing we can learn from his first mandate and the maximum pressure campaign was certainly effective. But is it sufficient for what it is that we are trying to achieve? That's why I propose that parallel to the maximum pressure campaign, and I hope Europe will join in sub-elements that could be added more pressure. For instance, the listing of the IRGC as a terrorist organization, which is yet to be implemented by Western governments, and couple this with a campaign of maximum support, energizing, invigorating the people on the streets in Iran so they can better organize and mobilize themselves in the campaign of civil disobedience. Perhaps the final coup de grace against the regime will be labor strikes that paralyzes the regime and forces an implosion. At the same time, this will be a cause for more defections from the regime. We already have seen sign of it. I've already had elements who, until yesteryear, believed in Again, maybe reform is still plausible, but that narrative has changed. Today, people know that the solution is to get out of this regime, but have a policy that also prepares the ground for post-regime in terms of the transition period, and how this defection makes most people who don't have their hands soiled with the blood of the Iranian people survive regime change and have a hope for the future, so they're not stuck in no man's land or forced to stay with the regime to the bitter end. That's part of the solution to minimize the cost to the nation to achieve the goals that they have. For that, we really need to have solidarity from the outside world.
Trumpets Pahlavi, it's always good to catch up with you. I feel like we're living through history when I see you.
Yeah.
Every few years we get together and so much happens in between.
Well, let's make a deal. Next time I see you, we'll be in Tehran. How's that?
Let's do that. That would be great.
Good to see you.
Great to see you. Thank you very much.